Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Young, welcome. Ms. Young, do you know what a dollar that you held at the start of the Biden administration is worth today?
I'm sure you'll let me know, Senator.
Well, it is a number you should know. It's worth 85 cents. That is driving an awful lot of the numbers on your budget here. It's causing an awful lot of pain for the American public. I want to kind of pick up where Senator Scott left off without really asking questions. But you take a look at what we were spending prior to the pandemic, about $4.4 trillion. I personally think in 2020 we spent too much. We started talking about the CARES Act. It was about $750 billion. Within a few weeks, that was up to $2.2 trillion. It wasn't money spent very efficiently. But I think we had to do something fast. We had to do something massive so that markets wouldn't collapse. But after 2020, we had, because we spent another $2 trillion in 2020, we had so much money sloshing around the economy. At most, I think we were down 25 million jobs for a few months. Within a few months, we were up to about 8 million job losses. But come January 2021, again, so much money sloshing around. There's so much pent-up demand. Those jobs are going to be coming back relatively soon. What do you think sparked the 40-year high inflation?
Senator, we can also talk about inflation that has come down by 2/3.
No, and again, that damage is done. Again, what sparked 40-year high inflation?
Most economists agree that coming out of a global pandemic, which is why we saw inflation across every major economy in this country, it was the supply chain issues, economies turning back on, coming out of a once-in-a-generation pandemic, which is why you saw inflation across the globe increase.
I mean, you don't think that too many dollars chasing too few goods is the primary cause of inflation? And when you spend $2 trillion one year over the next, and then you don't readjust the baseline, I mean, how can you justify spending $4.4 trillion? And as Senator Scott was saying, population grew less than 2% over this time frame. So we go from $4.4 trillion to 6.5. 2021, when President Biden comes into office, we spent 6.8. And then 6.3. We haven't reset to the 2019 baseline. How are we ever going to recover from this?
Senator, we put forth a proposal, a way to continue to invest in the American people. If we think we have adequate child care and paid leave in this country, I welcome us to talk to hardworking Americans. We can do that by asking the top 1% and 2% to add more into the system. That way, we can not only pay for our investments, but we can bring down the deficit by over $3 trillion. We can't just talk about spending as if it only hits those programs that hit working families in this country.
I think it's a fantasy. If you make the rich pay their fair share, and by the way, the top 1% garner about 20% of the income, pay about 40% of the income tax. I mean, at some point in time, you have to say, well, that's probably a pretty fair share. Okay?
Well, if you add sales
Double
tax
income
and local
tax,
tax, they pay about 25%.
But I remember when a couple $100 billion was like real money. The political process would be all upset if you're running a couple $100 billion a year deficit. Your plan to get us out of this, you're running deficits of 1.8, 1.5, 1.5, 1.5, 1.5, 1.6, 1. It never comes down. You're basically locking in at least $1.5 trillion deficits for the next 10 years. That's what you're budgeting. I mean, clearly, this is unsustainable. You don't worry about, once again, sparking massive inflation that further devalues the dollar from $1 to 85. What is going to go down to 70 to 60?
Senator, absolutely. That is why we put forth a plan that would actually bring deficits down by $3 trillion. We care about our fiscal path. This president has shown how you can still invest in the American people and achieve deficit reduction. And by the way, he worked with Republicans to sign a Fiscal Responsibility Act that would save $1 trillion on our deficit.
So you're proud of a 10-year budget that never reduces the deficit, never brings it down below basically 1.5 trillion?
Senator,
You're proud of that work?
Of course I'm proud of a budget that reduces deficits by over $3 trillion, that continues its investments in the American people. And by the way, most economists will tell you the way to look at our affordability of debt is to look at debt and deficit as a percentage of GDP. As a percentage of GDP, deficits are below 4.5%.
I don't think average Americans take a look at least $1.5 trillion deficits as far as the eye can see and think this administration is bringing down the deficit. I mean, that's just fantasy talk. Thank you.
Senator Kane, followed by
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You asked, why is the Federal Records Act not being followed? I think it's pretty simple. Administrations can ignore it with impunity. And why is that? Because Congress has allowed its oversight role to completely atrophy. This committee has allowed its oversight and investigatory capability to atrophy. That's the problem. So you can pass more laws, but until Congress steps up the plate and we accept our responsibility for doing this. I'll use an example. In June of 2021, because of FOIA requests, even though I'm sure other committees of Congress had been asking for these records, Anthony Fauci, or HHS, finally released Anthony Fauci's emails, about 4,000 pages. Within a week, Senator Paul, I think, joined me and 3 other members of this committee and requested those documents unredacted. Again, FOIA is subject to redactions. What is it, 7 different exemptions or 9, whatever. By the way, you never know whether those redactions are legitimate. We find repeatedly that they're illegitimate. They're not justified redactions, right? So going through the accommodation process, we asked for all 4,000. We got all 4,000 redacted. Again, Congress is not subject to those redactions. So through an accommodation process, we asked, okay, we want to focus on these 400 pages. We want to see them unredacted, or we want to get them. Well, they didn't give them to us. We could go down to a reading room, not make copies, but take notes. So we were able to review 350 of the 400 pages unredacted. That took a couple months. Now, since June of 2021, there are 50 pages of the Fauci emails. Okay, by the way, one of the exemptions they use frequently here is interagency, even though these emails are outside the agency. So again, completely fraudulent exemptions are being claimed. But I've asked the chairman to subpoena these records. I've asked the chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee Investigation to assist me, use his influence with this administration to get Secretary Becerra to give us these records. We had Secretary Becerra before the Senate Finance Committee a year ago. I did the same thing. I showed him these last 50 pages. And by the way, the law that governs when 5 members of this committee ask for something, it's like a subpoena. The agency shall turn the information over to us. He hasn't. I asked him last week, why haven't you turned these over? They haven't even produced a privilege log telling us why to justify these redactions. So again, the problem here is we are not insisting that the administration honor our constitutional responsibility and authority to conduct oversight and obtain these records on behalf of the American public. That's the problem. Senator Paul, I appreciate, and Mr. Ruskin, I appreciate you talking about the Dr. Morin's email. We did not, by the way, get that email unredacted from NIH. That came through our investigation in the minority here. Senator Paul and I joined in this request. I'm not going to tell you from who because we want active investigation. And you start disclosing that, you start ruining your investigation. But we obtained that email in a document dump of 175,000 pages. Now, my staff was able to pull that email out of that haystack. And, of course, we've written to Secretary Becerra. Explain this. Give us more documents. We've, of course, gotten no response from Secretary Becerra. We've gotten no help from the majority of this committee in uncovering this. So again, we can be talking about more laws, But part of the problem, I used to chair this committee. When I took over the chair, the permanent subcommittee investigation, the majority got $1 million budget. When Senator Peters took over the committee, his budget was increased 15%, and he cut the budget of the permanent subcommittee investigation by about 26%. It hasn't been restored. We're still down about 16% of what it was. Now, we got how many million people in the federal government? Millions, right? You know how many staff members the premier investigatory body of the United States Senate has? We've got 5. So again, you ask, why is the Federal Records Act followed? Because Congress is not interested in doing investigations or oversight, certainly not the Senate. If it were, we would have a dramatically increased budget for the permanent subcommittee investigation. We would have the majority in what I would consider a completely nonpartisan investigation, trying to figure out where did this pandemic start? We'd be working on this in a bipartisan fashion. We would have already subpoenaed years ago all of the Fauci emails, rather than remain silent and not allow or not have the majority join the minority in trying to get this information. So again, from my standpoint, I think this is pretty clear. Mr. Ruskin, I do have a question for you. I want you to speak to the difference between FOIA and redactions versus congressional oversight, which really the only legitimate purpose for withholding things would be executive privilege, which is quite limited, right? Executive privilege only applies to communications with the president, not interagency stuff. So, I mean, agency heads talking to each other, that's not executive privilege. It has to involve the president. Is that correct, Mr. Ruskin?
That's a correct description.
Microphone?
Yeah, I think that's correct.
Do you agree with my basic assessment here that the reason the administrations are getting away with this is they just learned over the decades as Congress has allowed its oversight ability to completely atrophy, that there's no penalty? There's none.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with your basic assessment that in general, over the last, say, 55 years or so, Congress's oversight of the federal government has declined, and that's really tragic. In addition, citizens' ability to do oversight of the federal government through the FOIA has been dramatically circumscribed just after the FOIA came into being, and that has continued on and continued to get worse. And so it's two problems together. As well, we have a dramatic lack of investigative reporters.
So, Mr. Chairman, if you're serious about this, subpoena these last 50 pages. Get on the phone with Secretary Becerra today and go, why don't we have these last 50 pages unredacted? And my guess is the reason we don't is as incriminating as the redacted emails were, there's some probably pretty juicy stuff under all those redactions. So again, join us, subpoena. Use the power of this committee. Use our constitutional authority, demand that the administration turn over these records. Thank you. This is a deficit by $3 trillion. President Obama, in his final budget, fiscal year 2017, his cumulative deficit was about $6 trillion. 4 years later, in President Trump's final budget for fiscal year 2021, his cumulative deficit over 10 years was $5.6 trillion. I mean, neither one of those presidents ever projected a deficit more than $1 trillion. President Biden came into office. He has yet to produce a budget where he proposed a deficit less than $1.3 trillion. So we went from President Trump's budget in fiscal year 2021 of $5.6 trillion. A year later, President Biden projected a 10-year deficit of $14.5 trillion. The following year, another $14.4 trillion. Last year's budget, he was projecting $17 trillion of 10-year cumulative deficit. This budget now is $16.3 trillion. Now, I see President Biden's budget going up $8 trillion over Trump's, then going up another $3 trillion over his own budget, and now coming down $1 trillion less than, not even $1 trillion, about $700 billion less. Where do you come up with saving $3 trillion in deficit?
Well, that's a straightforward calculation, which is compares the budget that he's proposed with the baseline that would exist if
Madam
current
Secretary,
law
again,
continues.
Again, the baseline he came in with was 5.6 trillion. He bumped that baseline to 14.5 trillion, maintained the 14.5 trillion, bumped that to 17 trillion, so he increased it 3 trillion. I guess brought it down 700 billion. Again, where do you get a $3 trillion reduction in deficit other than just making it up, pulling it out of thin air, which is what you've done?
Well, the president is not pulling it out of thin air. He's proposed a number of savings.
Where's the calculation? Tell me how you calculate a $3 trillion decrease in the deficit when you go from 5.6 trillion to 14.5, 17, and now 16. Where's a $3 trillion reduction deficit ever shown in the president's own budgets?
Well, I think if you look at the budget and you examine the tables, the table
I'm looking at the budget. I got the numbers here. I'm an accountant.
I do too.
I can do the math.
Table S3 gives the budget baseline, and then the table S4 gives the proposed budget, and you compare those two, and you'll see exactly where these numbers come from.
Provide me that calculation, please. Okay, I'd like to see that because I'm giving the numbers here, so I'd appreciate that calculation. Let me ask you a question. Do you know how much the federal government spent in total only 4 years ago in fiscal year 2019?
Well, that was pre-pandemic.
I realize that.
I don't have that number in front of me, but.
Okay, well, it was $4.4 trillion. You know how much how much U.S. population has grown since that point in time?
Few percent.
Yeah, less than 2%. Do you know how much you're proposing, what percent increase in you're proposing spending next year? We went up, from $4 trillion, $4.4 trillion, population grew at 2%. Do you know what percent increase?
The population aged, and because we have an older population spending on Social Security, Medicare.
The answer to the question is you're increasing spending 63%. Almost $3 trillion over what we spent, 4.4 up to 7.3 trillion. How can you justify that?
Senator Johnson, let's let the Secretary answer your question.
Well, the President has proposed a budget that I regard as fiscally responsible. You are looking at one metric, which is the dollar value of the deficit. I think a more relevant economic measure is real net interest as a share of GDP. We have a strongly growing economy with a much larger GDP. And if you look at table S1, you'll see that the proposed budget stabilizes real net interest over 10 years at an historically normal level. And the president's budget helps Americans lower costs that are tremendously burdensome to them. It provides adequate funding to the Internal Revenue Service so that they can collect taxes that are due and shrink what is an utterly enormous tax gap amounting to about $150 billion a year.
The president's massive deficit spending has caused the value of a dollar to decrease from $1 to 85 cents during his administration. That's what the president's budget is.
The time of the gentleman's expired. Senator Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here. Thank you.
Can I answer your questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start with Mr. Martinez because we're talking about pensions and investments. When you hold a U.S. Treasury and it's at low interest rate and the interest goes up, the value of that bond goes down, correct?
Goes down.
Do you have to recognize that on your income statement, or because you hold these things to maturity, do you not recognize that loss?
We will do indirectly in that the OPM, and not us, not our auditors, calculate actuarially what our amortization of unfunded pensions are. To the extent that our value goes down, then that cost goes up. Theoretically, but I don't know they tell us what it is that we have to put in.
So, again, I'd be surprised if you had to downvalue that because you're holding it to maturity. You're just getting hit by the fact that you're earning a very low rate of return versus what's available in the marketplace. By the way, the comment you made in terms of the $800 billion of lost opportunity, had you invested that in just a normal type of balanced fund, would have also been true for Social Security had we not spent that money and invested that in, I know they didn't exist at the time, but some kind of ETF or some kind of Dow Jones index fund, we'd have $7 or $8 trillion in real assets, but we didn't do that. We spent the money, it's gone. But
If we had been able to
different
invest
point.
like Amtrak or TVA on a diversified portfolio, that surplus would have been money that we wouldn't have had to put into the pension fund, but rather spend on our capital investments.
So this gets me to my next point, and it's the constraints that the Postmaster General talked about. Basically you're operating and reporting to a 400 or 535 member board of directors here that impose on you certain business conditions that you would not recognize, or you wouldn't operate that way if you're in the private sector, right, Mr. Postmaster General?
Well, we have laws that we need to follow and have different impacts on us, used to protect the monopoly that no longer exists.
Right, so the question I have is, what are those major constraints? Let's get them on the table. What does Congress force you to do that in any kind of rational private sector business you wouldn't do because you keep losing your you-know-what?
Yeah. Well, I think the first part was the was the pre-funding legislation that we worked together to get passed last year.
You did get infusion. I never would have thought this would happen. I was chairman. $100 billion plus to offload part of that.
That's a perspective that I don't share. Right? It was a
non-cash adjustment to the balance sheet.
Let me finish. Ron.
Sorry.
You relieved of liability.
That was legislation.
By the way, how much of the liability were you relieved of? I'm not up to speed on those numbers. I mean, your total unfunded liability pension was over $200 billion, correct?
We still have the same obligations long-term to pay for our retirement
Not having to
health care.
recognize it.
It's just the pre-funding legislation that was passed in 2006, probably the dagger in the heart of the Postal Service between what it did with regard to the pre-funding and also the price fixing that it instituted, that the PRC oversaw, right? That through basic division, you would have seen that. I mean, you were seeing it every year, $10 billion losses,
Yeah,
$20 billion.
we talked about that. Again,
Okay.
that was an insane bill that was passed, what,
Okay,
2006?
but there's a whole bunch of the same
forced
things that
and,
have the consequences
again,
today that we're trying
that's
to
the 535-member
fix.
genius board
Yeah.
that
I
you
appreciate
report
the
to.
legislation that you passed, right? That gave us room to move forward. I would have liked to seen CSRS get it signed off. It didn't. I'm moving forward in operational and financial, revenue producing issues. I think the Postal Service Regulatory Commission needs to be looked at, right, in terms of what their impact and effect. I have a Senate-appointed board, a Senate-appointed commission. These are, I think that this organization is not set up to deal with what this Congress is asking us to do, which is compete in the we have $39 billion worth of mail. It costs us $65 billion to deliver it. The only way to make that up is by driving cost out, potentially
which you're not allowed to do in many cases. I mean,
right.
You're constraining what you can do in terms of
grow
cost
in the
saving
package
measures.
and grow in the package market, which we are, and we're driving cost out too. I am hopeful. We've had these short-term issues, but go to some of these operations. Go look at the difference in Atlanta. Go look at the overall strategy. No strategy existed. This was a randomly deployed, haphazard organization that had no mission. There's a purpose within the organization now. People are engaged in terms of trying to make this work, and the strategy is not that complex. It's simple. Load your trucks.
So again, what Congress does what it always does. I mean, they throw more money at the problem. My guess, when you get a few tens of billions of dollars thrown at you can use it to some effective impact.
Listen, I have not. I've asked for that's what I have asked for. I think we have an operational path forward to solve a lot of this problem. If it's not without consequence as we do it, but I'm pretty positive about what everybody's engaged in the organization, including our union leadership.
So again, what I would try and elicit, and can't really do it in 7 minutes, but if you could do it offline, I mean, I would really like to fully understand what those constraints are, and if you really could change the law. Again, I say without affecting service, you're going to affect service. You can't continue to do what we keep doing in a declining market environment. But anyway, I'd like to hear from that. I do have one other question submitted by one of my constituents who actually produced the blue boxes. Apparently, you're going to higher security blue boxes, and they're just asking, are you going to be issuing, I guess, the specs on those, some kind of strategic plan so they can plan on it, so they can deliver those blue boxes to you as a cost-effective manner as possible?
I think we have purchased about 25,000 high-security boxes, and we have a deployment plan, so if you want, I could get with our retail and delivery group and the inspection service.
Okay, yeah, if you
and
could get us in contact with somebody just on the basis
Not
of
somebody
this.
who wants to break into them, is it?
Pardon?
It's not somebody who wants to break into them, is it?
I don't think so. I think this is a cooperative type of question. But thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Hassan.
Accountability. Again, thank you to the witnesses for being here today, and I turn now to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to start by thanking our witnesses, your courage in coming forward as whistleblowers. I want to underscore what you did say, that this is we all want Boeing to succeed. I would ask that my written opening statement be entered in the record. Prior to this hearing, I talked to stakeholders. I talked to airlines, your Boeing's customers. I talked to Boeing representatives. It was a overall theme that everybody wants Boeing to succeed. We need them to succeed because, as a traveling public, we want to feel safe in the air. And I think I entered this investigation acknowledging the fact that airline travel is still probably the safest way to travel. It's what I keep telling myself when I hop on an airplane, and even when I hop on a 737 MAX, it's been taken care of. We need more whistleblowers. Not only in Boeing, but we need them in the airline, in their maintenance departments. We need whistleblowers from the FAA. This is a very complex business. They're complex products. It's a complex problem. And so I appreciate this hearing. I'm a little concerned. What I don't want this committee to do is scare the you-know-what out of the American public. In the end, I want the public to be confident in getting on an airplane and experiencing air travel. But I have to admit, this testimony is more than troubling. And as I was reading the testimony last night, as I've read more things this morning, as a matter of fact, I'm going to enter an article that I was given to this morning, written on April 3rd in City Journal. The title is, "An Insider Explains What Has Gone Disastrously Wrong with Boeing." We have to be concerned about what's happening. And we've got to get to the bottom of this. This is going to take a lot of work. This is going to take a lot of investigation. And again, we need to hold these hearings, but we need to do the detailed work, and we need more information. We need people coming forward on all sides, okay? But I do want to just quote from this article. It's an interview with an insider, a whistleblower that's not coming public. But he tells a story of elite dysfunction, financial abstraction, and DEI bureaucracy that has poisoned the culture, creating a sense of profound alienation between the people who occupy the executive suite and those who build airplanes. Goes on, right now, we have an executive council running the company, Boeing, that is all outsiders. The current CEO is a General Electric guy, as is the CFO whom we brought in. We have a completely new HR leader with no background at Boeing. The head of our commercial airplanes unit in Seattle, who was fired last week, was one of the last engineers in the executive council. The headquarters in Arlington is empty. Nobody lives there. This is an empty executive suite. The CEO lives in New Hampshire. The CFO lives in Connecticut. The head of HR lives in Orlando. We just instituted a policy that everyone has to come to work 5 days a week except the executive council, which can use private jets to travel to meetings. and that is the story. It's a company that is under caretakers. It's not under owners, and it's not under people who love airlines. In this business, the workforce knows if you love the thing you are building or if it's just another set of assets to you. At some point, you cannot recover that process or recover with process. You cannot recover with process what you have lost with love. And I think is probably the most important story of all. There's no visible center of the company, and the people are wondering what they're connected to. Now, again, I read this morning after having read the troubling testimony. There's some real problems at Boeing that need to be fixed, and I'm not exactly sure how they're going to get fixed, but again, this investigation has to include not only Boeing, it's got to include how airlines maintain Boeing products, but it's also got to look at the FAA and government and where government has potentially dropped the ball as well. So again, this has to be a detailed investigation, and the end result has to be toward helping Boeing succeed by exposing the truth. So again, I appreciate the hearing, and I'm looking forward to the witnesses, and again, thank them for their participation.
Thank you very much, Senator Johnson. I think you've heard bipartisan accord.
For this hearing today, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Senator Kane. Next is Senator Johnson, followed by Senator Van Hollen, and then Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start again as I normally do in these hearings. I'm not a climate change denier. I'm just not an alarmist. Climate has always changed, always will. We'll have to adapt. Let me start asking any of the witnesses. Anybody know how much the sea level has increased in the Bay of San Francisco since the last glaciation period, 12 to 20,000 years ago? Anybody? Mr. Dwyer, you're concerned about 18 inches, and undeniable. Anyone take a guess? 390 feet. Do you think there's anything we could have done to prevent the sea level rising 390 feet over the last, let's say, 20,000 years? The answer to that is no, okay? The Vostok ice core sample shows 5 pretty distinct cycles of temperature variation of almost 23 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything we could have done to stop that? Anybody know how much we've spent globally on trying to turn back the tides to prevent climate change? Anybody have an estimate of that? We had a witness from AEI estimated about $5 trillion. This is before the Inflation Reduction Act that claims about $400 billion. Goldman Sachs says really about 1.2. So let's say it's $6 trillion of spending globally trying to combat climate change. Have we impacted climate change at all? Yeah, I still see the same level of hair on fire alarmism. Got to spend more money. To what effect?
Senator, as a veteran of nearly 200 combat missions and over 1,000 carrier landings in high-performance jets, I have never been accused of being an alarmist. I have been accused of being very analytical, data-driven, and I think that
you didn't know that the sea level had risen 390 feet. Don't you think that's an important data point when you're assessing climate change?
It isn't in the human lifespan as important.
But the human lifespan, we're a blip in these major geologic trends. We're a blip. Now, you can blow up that blip and turn to an alarmism. Admiral Gwynn, let me ask you a question. You're into business now, right?
Yes.
What kind of business are you in?
I'm in the business of energy, environment, and economy.
And what does that business do?
Well, basically, taking a look at the opportunities that we have to transition from our energy portfolio, which is primarily and has for good reasons been relying on fossil fuel.
Who are your clients?
I'm not going to share those right now because of non-disclosure
Is it safe to say it's a lot, maybe Defense Department and the government?
No, it's not. No.
Would you say that your opportunities spring from the fact that we have this climate change crisis on our hands, creating opportunities for your business?
It's not an opportunity that springs from climate change. It's an opportunity to increase economic development and create jobs.
So we've talked a lot about studies, right? Anybody read the Wall Street Journal article today about a publisher named Wiley, been around for 217 years, is shutting down 19 journals because over the last 2 years they've had to retract 11,300 fraudulent research studies. Has anybody listened to President Eisenhower's farewell address recently? Not only did he warn us about the military-industrial complex, which we have not heeded that warning at all. Second warning was he warned us about public government financing of science and research, implying that if government's funding research, those scientists are going to be more concerned about getting a research grant, turning a crisis into an opportunity, and that would corrupt science. You know, we've known about fraudulent research studies now for decades. We just haven't talked about it. We've ignored it. We've covered it up. But I would argue fraudulent research is probably fueling more of the climate alarmism, creating opportunities than anything else. I'm just not buying the science. When you take a look at actual science, like 390 feet sea level rise, like the Vostok ice core sample, do you realize that CO2 in those Vostok ice core graphs is a lagging indicator? Temperature rises first, then CO2 comes later. Did anybody realize that? Admiral, did you want to comment on that? You're a PhD on this.
I do want to comment on that, Senator Johnson. Thank you. I think it is true that there is a bias in the media and some scientific journals towards negative reporting of climate change impacts. You never believe this if you, in view of the administration's trove of climate directives, but many climate indices related to human and society well-being have been on an upward trend for the last 50 years, despite the 1.3 degrees Celsius of warming that's occurred. And this is things like crop yields and calories per individual. And these are global statistics you can go find on our World in Data. Things like death rates due to natural disasters, the incidences of diseases related to climate like malaria, those are going down. Malnutrition and famine, those trends are also going down. And then extreme poverty throughout the world has also plummeted. So there's a lot of positive results of technology and our energy posture, frankly. And right now there are 3 billion people who are in an energy poverty status. I encourage everyone to look up the Breakthrough Institute and see the recent article by Dr. Patrick Brown on this topic.
My final comment, just imagine the human suffering we could have alleviated spending $5 to $6 trillion trying to alleviate that rather than hold back the tides, which we won't be able to do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just for the record, the last time that I can recall.
The ranking member, we're going to adhere strictly to the 7 minutes so that everybody gets a chance, and then we'll come back for another round.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. By the way, there's an ongoing investigation as one of the primary excuses always used to prevent disclosure to Congress. So chalk that up to another one from the workshop. Comment on Fagan, did I hear you right? You testified that you've turned all the documents over to the committee?
We have been working in good faith with the committee, rolling production of documents. We began this process last summer, added people and resourcing to ensure that we're able to get into a regular production of documents. This is an unprecedented undertaking for the organization. There were just short of 2 million pages of documents that were initially looked at with regard to potentially being responsive to the issues that the subcommittee is interested in. We have turned over 18,000 pages of documents to the subcommittee responsive to the ask. That includes 91 reports of investigation from assaults that occurred at the Coast Guard Academy. I understand and we have done this consistent with advice from the General Counsel, consistent with protection of victim privacy and victim dignity, witness privacy, sensitive public health information, attorney-client privilege, and the pre-deliberation or pre-decisional documents. Okay, in those cases where the committee, we have offered in-camera review. It's a standing and open offer for in-camera review. Any one of the documents that you have, we welcome the opportunity to continue to work in good faith with the committee to provide the documents.
So, Bob, we haven't received all the documents.
You've received,
Bob, we have not received all the documents. They're still going under review.
we have completed the review. You've received all of the responsive documents.
One of the documents, and I asked you when we first met in my office, showed you an email. There was an attachment to that email. The attachment wasn't provided, and you made the commitment to provide us that attachment. I believe what that was an earlier version of the report, an earlier draft of the report on Operation Fouled Anchor. You committed to provide that. That has not been provided to us, correct?
Well, we'll work back through your committee. I know you've got the Fouled Anchor report, the final report.
Okay, again, part of our investigation would be to see earlier drafts in terms of what, again, I view this as a cover-up. So when you're investigating a cover-up, some of the documents you're going to want is, okay, we see the final report from a 5-year investigation. You know, we're aware of the fact that that initial report, the initial draft, was 11 pages. It would be very interesting, I think, important for us to see what was cut out of that 11 pages to produce a 6-page report. So when can we expect to see the original drafts, the 11-page initial draft of the report?
I continue to work with my general counsel and am taking advice with regard to.
What excuse would be given to not turn over the initial draft of the report? If you want to be fully transparent, what could possibly prevent that from happening?
I continue to work in good faith with the committee to provide documents, and will provide
Again, good faith is always the excuse you hear. Who do you report to?
I report to Secretary Mayorkas.
Have you spoken to Secretary Mayorkas about this situation?
Yes.
What kind of interest has she shown in, let's face it, in this cover-up?
This is not a cover-up. I am committed to providing documents in good faith. This is an incredible organization, and I am committed to bringing the organization forward and making the culture change necessary, and I understand that there's a responsiveness to the committee. I remain committed to that, and I continue to work with my own lawyers and the department to ensure that we are providing documents consistent with executive branch and constitutional, the constitutional process with regard to accommodation.
Again, you have to understand, I've heard this time and time again over multiple investigations. It's the exact same excuses given all the time in terms of not being responsive. You talk 2 million pages. Well, we've already cut it down to somewhere between 25 and 30. You've turned over 17, but in particular, when there's a document that you request, you know, from a U.S. Senator to the Commandant of the Coast Guard, and the Commandant of the Coast Guard said, yeah, we'll provide that document, and it's not provided. And again, I'm not talking 2 million pages. I'm not talking 25,000 pages. I'm talking about an 11-page initial draft of the report on an investigation that took 5 years, that was then covered up for a number of years, and I can't get that 11 pages. We can't get that 11 pages. Why?
I remain committed.
Have you read that full 11-page draft report?
I have not read the pre-decisional 11-page report. I have read the final Fouled Anchor report that was closed out in February of 2020.
You haven't been inquisitive enough to read the initial draft?
I am focused on.
There's obviously a reason I want to see it. There's obviously a reason I'm making a point of it in this hearing. I think it could be very revealing in terms of what the Coast Guard at that point in time decided, well, we don't want to include that. That might harm our institution. That might be embarrassing. So let's leave that out. We'll give them these 6 pages. We'll leave these 5 pages out. So if I get nothing out of this hearing today, is I'd like a complete commitment to show us that full 11-page draft report. If we have to review it in camera, fine. I can go read 11 pages in camera. It's a little more difficult to do another 10 or 20,000 pages. That's why we need these documents here, so that, we can search them. We can get them on our computer. We can search for key phrases. I mean, there's a way you do these investigations. In-camera reviews is not a very good way of doing it, but I'll make an exception for these 11 pages. Can I get that commitment?
I will commit to providing those 11 pages in camera review.
Okay, thank you.
Senator.
Chairman, in Eisenhower's very prescient farewell speech, he not only warned us about the military industrial complex, he warned us about government funding of research. He said, if you do that, scientists are going to be more interested in their grant, in obtaining a grant, than pursuing truthful science. He said you end up with a scientific and technological elite that would drive public policy, and I think we witnessed that during COVID. They drove it in a very bad direction. So I want to talk about the cover-up again. Dr. Gary, how much have you received in government grants over your career? Do you have any figure in that, a ballpark?
Sir, I'm not sure.
Hundreds of millions?
Back. Not hundreds.
So I have information that between you and Dr. Kirsten Anderson, since 2020, between 2020 and 2022, you received $25.2 million in grants from the NIH.
That's possible.
That's accurate? Okay,
Could be.
So after you write the proximal origin theory, you've been working with Dr. Fauci how many years?
Well, I don't actually work directly with Dr. Fauci.
Well, I mean, you've certainly come to his aid and testified kind of in his support during AIDS. But the fact is, you cashiered $25.2 million in government grants after writing the proximal origin paper, didn't you? $25.2 million in grants. And again, it's Anthony Fauci.
It wasn't because we wrote
Anthony
that,
Fauci has let out billions of dollars worth of grants, right? He controls an awful lot of information. Again, the point being, why would they cover it up? January 27, 2020, Dr. Fauci is informed via email that NIAID has been funding coronavirus project in China for the last 5 years. Okay, so he's given, these are the emails that were FOIA'd. They weren't given to us, and they're heavily redacted. January 31st, he starts conversations with Dr. Anderson and et al., Dr. Gary. February 1st, Dr. Fauci emails, and my screen went dead on me here, rats. Do you have that? Fauci emails his principal deputy director, Hugh Auchincloss. And here's the... He said, Hugh, it is essential that we speak this AM. Keep your cell phone on. I have a conference call at 7:45. These will likely be over at 8:45. Read this paper as well as the email that I will forward to you. You will have tasks today that must be done. Now, that is somebody who's scrambling to cover up his backside for funding dangerous research at the Wuhan lab for 5 years. Is that correct? Dr. Ebright, I'll ask you that question, but in addition, you've basically accused Dr. Gary of scientific misconduct, possibly as serious as fraud. Why don't you address that? Because I would agree with you.
Both on the proximal origin paper, I have signed 2 letters by teams of scientists requesting an editorial review of that paper for retraction for misconduct. And then on 2 of the market papers, there are only 4 published, only 2
but
published.
Again, what was the misconduct okay, so you've accused him, but what was the misconduct
The primary misconduct, the misconduct of highest importance, was stating conclusions the authors knew at the time, contemporaneously, while writing the paper, submitting the paper, and publishing the paper, were untrue. This is the most egregious form of scientific misconduct, publishing a paper where you know the conclusions are untrue.
And of course, the reason we didn't get those emails other than through a court order is that the emails themselves were so unbelievably incriminating
that
correct. They thought one thing and wrote the exact other for an article that then was quoted like 5,800 times. I mean, that, again, as Senator Hawley and others have pointed out, destroyed people's careers. They were ridiculed. They were vilified.
Yes.
That is scientific misconduct and fraud. And and Dr. Gary, I have to say, if people are bemoaning the fact that people no longer trust science or that we don't trust our federal health agencies, the reason the American public legitimately don't trust scientists and federal health agencies are because of people like you. You bear that responsibility for violating the public's trust from your scientific misconduct and fraud. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Gary, you can. Thank you so much. So I would just encourage people to go and read the Nature Medicine article, The Proximal Origins of SARS-CoV-2. We didn't put anything in that paper that we didn't believe was true. The conclusions of that paper have held up very well. In fact, there's been an abundance of scientific evidence that has come forward since then to support all the conclusions, everything we wrote in that paper. So there's no fraud. Yes, indeed, some of the authors changed their mind during the course of writing that paper over a period of weeks. That's not fraud, sir. That is just the way that the scientific method works.
So, Mr. Chairman, I would ask consent to enter all these Slack messages from this, Dr. Anderson et al., that group, that have all these quotes into our hearing record, and we'll provide them to you. Thank you.
No objection. Senator Marshall, you recognize for your questions.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To pick up where the chairman just left off, you said you'll check into that. Did you talk to the individual responsible for complying with our information requests? Have you had a meeting with that individual or that group of individuals?
Senator Johnson, my team knows, and I have talked to them about the need for transparency at every level and every stage. So beyond that, as a backdrop, no, I did not review each line item.
So who would be your direct report responsible for providing this committee the information, the subcommittee the information it requested?
Yeah, it'll be a combination of my counsel and my government affairs office.
Okay, so you'll talk to them today about this?
Yes, well, they're right behind me, and so I'm sure, yes, it's registered.
You said you've listened to the whistleblowers. Have you directly spoken to any of the whistleblowers?
I have not directly spoken to any of the whistleblowers.
Do you think that'd be a good idea to do that?
Yeah, I think it would.
I'd recommend it.
Yep.
Exactly what are you doing then to investigate the whistleblower complaints? If you haven't spoken to them directly.
Yes, sir.
I mean, again, have you just turned it over to your counsel or?
No, we have a team. We have an ethics hotline and a team of investigators. The most important thing in every whistleblower out of the chute is to make sure we understand the substantive issue that is being discussed and do safety analysis immediately. And go out and interview everybody that's involved and or has touched any of that work and assure ourselves that we have safe airplanes. And if there are corrective actions to take with respect to the points that they make with us, that's what we do. And we try to get on that immediately. But there's always an objective view and a number of perspectives, particularly with respect to engineering disciplines that have to come to bear on it.
So how many employees does Boeing have?
170,000.
So having run a much smaller operation, I mean, first thing I can say is I realize that I don't control what everybody does. You try and set policies. You can communicate as clearly as possible. People are people. The question I have for you, because it's actually quite shocking to have a supervisor calling somebody up 19 times in one day, and making the statement that I'm going to break you. My guess is you don't condone that kind of behavior. Have you looked at your incentive system within Boeing? And let's face it, there's obviously pressure on your sales, from your sales force to your manufacturing operation to deliver the planes that they've sold to airlines. Again, there's pressure throughout companies, and I can just imagine that the pressure is being applied to Boeing associates throughout the company. Okay, I get that. I've been in manufacturing. But have you reviewed, for example, your incentive systems that maybe would drive that kind of behavior, having to meet quotas, or, have you reviewed that?
Yeah, this year we made a number of significant changes to our incentive structure that really emphasizes all things safety, including the running a just culture with that respect. And a just culture, I think, is the environment that you would like us to run. And so yes, that incentive alignment is now in place.
So prior to our last hearing, one of the articles I read, whether fair or unfair, talked about, and your disclosures, it's probably the SEC, where you were scoring high on ESG and DEI, and your score was 0 on your quality. These are internal quality performance measures. Can you speak to that report?
That's a fact.
Because the point being is,
Yes.
is Boeing's management, are they concentrating on DEI and ESG and at the expense of really meeting your quality performance measures?
Senator, I've never seen those two things ever come into conflict. I don't believe my team has ever allowed for them to come into conflict in any way.
It's not necessarily conflict, it's what you're emphasizing, where are you putting your management emphasis?
Yes. Well, again, Senator, there's a comp system. There's also what we work on every day, all day, knowing how important and critical it is for the future of our company. Safety and quality is it. It's been that way since January of 2020 because of what we have been responding to. Safety and quality. That is what we talk about.
I'll mention another article, and the reason I'm doing this is one of the reasons we need a free press. It'd be nice to have a completely unbiased free press, but we need investigative reporting. We only have so much staff here at a subcommittee level or even a committee level, so we really do need journalists going out there and digging up stories. One of the ones I thought interesting before this hearing spoke to the very real problem, the difficulty you are having in finding, well, first of all, your workforce, manufacturing workforce is aging. Throwing COVID on there, early retirements, that type of thing, you lost a lot of experience. And in the past, it sounds like Boeing was able to tap into a workforce that had experience in the aerospace industry. And you don't have that luxury anymore. I'm not exactly sure when that changed. I know, coming from manufacturing myself, it's been difficult to hire people in a manufacturing operation because, let's face it, we tell our kids, you got to get a 4-year degree and you want to be in management. So we don't encourage people to go into manufacturing. But can you speak to that issue, or maybe Mr. McKenzie can speak to that issue in terms of just your challenges in hiring people in a manufacturing setting for a very high-quality, high-demand aerospace industry?
Senator Johnson, and I appreciate the question more than you know. The post-COVID moment in the aerospace industry has been unbelievably difficult to navigate. We have 10,000 suppliers. We put almost 2.5 million parts into a 787. Boeing, because it's big and it has resources, even those were strained, we were able to keep more than most. But like you say, we turned over a lot of people, and yes, a lot of experienced people. Our supply chain experienced enormous turnover. So as we try to respond to unbelievable demand for airplanes out there, we have a supply constraint that is very real, and it is not resolved today. And I think one of the most important things we can do, we've done it in a few large instances, but now we have to train ourselves to do it at small instances, meaning every employee. If a part's not there on time, if a part's non-conforming, we will stop the line. So much of this relates to an untrained workforce. I tell you, it's all about that, honestly.
Thank you. Senator Johnson, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the ranking member for holding this very important hearing. We need a lot more of these. I want to thank all the witnesses for your very detailed testimony. And I'd encourage anybody viewing this hearing to go online and read the detailed testimony. I think you'll find it very difficult to not come away after reading that we may not have a smoking gun, but the circumstantial evidence is strong that this was a man-made virus and that it was probably leaked from a lab, probably at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. One thing that's convinced me very early on, I've been convinced this quite some time, is just the cover-up. I mean, the fact the Chinese took down data sets. So all of a sudden you couldn't find a smoking gun because it no longer exists, and we'll probably never know that. But also the cover-up here within the U.S. government. I've been doing oversight on our response to COVID, which, by the way, was a miserable failure. we're 4% of the world's population. We apparently experience 16% of the deaths. We're supposedly the most modern medical system in the world. That's a miserable failure. And so we need to do a lot of oversight, not just on the origin, which is an important aspect of this, but on everything, okay? If we're serious about this, by the way, we got to start letting subpoenas start flying. I'll do this one more time. I've done this multiple times. This is the 50 final pages of Fauci's emails. By the way, the only reason we realize that Fauci was engaged in a cover-up with Dr. Gary is the fact that we had to FOIA these. They didn't turn these over, which they should have. We had to FOIA them. We had to go to court. Our staff has taken the 4,000 pages that we got that were redacted, narrowed those down to 400 pages, and they allowed us to look at these things unredacted in a reading room. 350 pages, but not the final 50. In terms of the cover-up, my guess is the smoking gun exists somewhere under these heavy redactions. So my suggestion, actually my plea to the chairman is to issue a subpoena to get these final 50 pages. Then maybe we'll get a full extent of the extensive cover-up. Dr. Gary, I don't know, have you ever used the word conspiracy theory as it relates to the lab leak? Have you ever accused people who put that thing forward, they're a bunch of conspiracy theorists?
Not in my public.
Okay, well, I'll tell you who has, is the chief editor-in-chief of Nature magazine that published the proximal origin. He said, talking about your study, your cover-up, great work. We'll put conspiracy theories about the origin of SARS-CoV-2 to rest. Will you at least admit that people who are raising the possibility of a lab leak were not conspiracy theorists, that they were legitimate concern about gain-of-function research creating this chimeric virus?
Of course, sir. I mean, that would include us at the very beginning.
That's progress. That's progress because, again, an awful lot of people's reputations were ruined by this cover-up and by the accusations of people being conspiracy theorists. Dr. Ebright, the purpose of this hearing really is to talk about the danger of gain-of-function research. Right now we're about ready to be scaremongered. I think we're already being scaremongered on H5N1. Back in late 2011, the world learned of two scientific teams, one in University of Wisconsin-Madison, one in the Netherlands, that had apparently said each of these labs created H5N1 viruses that had gained the ability to spread through the air between ferrets. The animal model used to study how flu viruses might behave in humans. That's pretty darn dangerous stuff, right? That is primarily what led to the moratorium on gain of function, correct?
That is correct.
What possible reason is there to be producing what nature probably couldn't produce? Why are we doing this?
It's important to emphasize that the research in question has zero civilian practical applications. Gain-of-function research on potential pandemic pathogens is not used and does not contribute to the development of vaccines and is not used and does not contribute to the development of drugs.
So again, that rationale for all this research is exactly that. In case we have to respond, but that's the rationale. In case we have to respond to a bioweapon attack, okay? We need a defense mechanism. So that's the reason, for example, the Defense Department has spent $42 million or funded EcoHealth Alliance for $42 million and USAID for $53 million, correct?
So the current definition is research that is reasonably anticipated to increase either the transmissibility or the virulence of a potential pandemic pathogen. That research does not contribute to developing countermeasures against potential pandemic pathogens.
That's the rationale they used. The thing they really scared the public on was the 1918 flu pandemic, correct? Even Anthony Fauci has admitted most people who died of the flu pandemic died of pneumonia because we didn't have antibiotics, correct?
Bacterial pneumonia.
I think one of the things we have to provide oversight is the sabotage of early treatment using widely available, cheap, and safe generic drugs. We didn't do that. I mean, from my standpoint, the first thing we ought to be doing in any kind of pandemic is there some way to treat this? and let doctors be doctors, let them practice medicine. Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of Miller's ratchet, correct?
Of what?
Miller's ratchet. Okay, well, it's basically what viruses generally do is they'll become more transmissible but less pathogenic. Okay, because again, it doesn't do, a virus snuffs itself out. MERS snuffed itself out. SARS snuffed itself out, except there were a couple lab leaks that produced SARS outbreaks, correct? So again, my point is, are we making things worse with human intervention? Producing vaccines that are not sterilizing, that allow variants to be produced, and things like antibody-dependent enhancement. Again, there's an awful lot of concern that we don't even consider here because we're on this quest to have a vaccine for everything and produce vaccines for viruses that haven't even been created yet in the lab. Again, that's the question we ought to be asking in this committee is, what in the world are we doing? What's the rationale for doing this? And are we actually causing more harm than good?
With vaccine development, I would disagree. The vaccines in general, do not pose significant harms and offer significant benefits. With respect to the gain-of-function research, which creates new threats, biological threats that do not exist currently and might not naturally come into existence in a decade, a century, or a millennium, that research creates threats. And those threats are existentially risky threats. And that research is being conducted without a justifiable rationale. There is no rationale in terms of development of countermeasures. Industry develops vaccines and therapeutics against diseases currently in humans, not against diseases that don't yet exist and need to be made in a lab.
We could use a public debate regarding all things vaccine, the profit motive of it, and everything else, but that's for another day.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Senator Marshall, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Regards to direct payment. So you reimburse credit cards in a different way. What are the requirements for reimbursing credit cards? And by the way, I think it works pretty well. We've been able to stop payment and get reimbursed for things, as well as had fraud prevented. You know, we get calls. We've had to reissue our credit cards in the past because somebody's got a credit card number. So I think that system works pretty well. But describe, I'll start with you, Mr. Monaco. Describe the difference between credit cards and Zelle from a standpoint of how the banks reimburse and what you're required to reimburse.
Well, first of all, Senator, thank you for the question. Zelle and credit cards are fundamentally different payment methods. Credit cards are regulated under Reg Z.
Again, what do you reimburse for credit cards versus what you reimburse for Zelle? Just let's clarify that.
So under circumstances where a customer's card is lost or stolen and there's a purchase, we would reimburse for that.
So if somebody's using a card unauthorized, you reimburse for that?
Yes, sir. Right.
Okay.
And there are other chargeback circumstances which you referenced before, right, where the seller or the merchant hasn't lived up to their obligation, where we would reimburse our customer and then seek to recover through the
and then that becomes a dispute between you and the vendor. And you fight that out. But I mean, basically, you make the consumer whole almost with no questions asked.
Yeah, under the various network rules, depending on the circumstances. But yes, there's a dispute resolution mechanism. And if the merchant is found to have not lived up to their obligations under those rules, then yes, we reimburse.
Collectively, banks have about $160 billion of interchange fees to work with to make those reimbursements, correct? Which you do not have with Zelle.
That's correct, sir. Credit cards carry this notion of purchase protection that is built into the product as a feature of the product.
And it costs consumers $160 billion in some way, shape, or form.
Yes, sir. And Zelle
so isn't it true that banks would rather have your customers use your credit cards rather than Zelle?
Senator, we want our...
I would as a business guy. If I could generate $160 billion versus giving away something free, use that.
We offer our customers a number of different payment methods.
Right. And again, I'm trying to zero down. So why do you offer Zelle? Because your customers want it.
100%.
And why do you offer Zelle pretty much for free, Mr. Fowler? Because you use the data and you can make money off selling that data, correct?
Senator, that's not correct.
Okay,
We don't make money selling the data. The information.
So somebody is using this consumer data for something, correct? I mean, all these, billions of dollars transactions, this data is being used by somebody somehow, correct?
Senator, I would say I can only comment on Zelle, but I just want to be incredibly clear. Privacy by design is underpinning the Zelle network. What that means is we run a token system, which is only name, email, mobile number, and financial institution. That is the information we have about any consumer using the network. That information is used, the tokens used for the transaction. We do monitor interactions between sender and receiver. Of course we do. We do that to protect the network and ensure that the financial institutions, the 2,100 financial institutions, know everything there is to know about what's going on, but we categorically do not sell any data associated with the Zelle network to anyone for any reason ever.
So the banks, do you benefit at all from the data generated from your customers' use of Zelle? I'll go to Mr. Monaco.
Sir, we benefit from the products, the risk management products that Early Warning produces, right, which is really the core of the company from its original founding, way before Zelle. So that is products such as account verification, right, so we know it's a valid account. Other products. That's how we benefit. We do not make we do not make money off it. We use it to keep all of our products safe, whether it be a checking account or a
credit card transactions. I mean, is that who you're using to detect fraud in your credit cards? Early warning systems.
It's one of the many inputs and models that we use.
Again, I'm just really trying to understand the economic model, why you're offering something for free that obviously your customers value.
So, sir,
I mean, how many, you have over 100 million customers that use this, and how many billions of transactions on Zelle? So somebody has getting value out of this, right? And okay, there's fraud, people use this and there's scams and fraud and that type of thing, but it's at a pretty low percentage. Yeah, I'm just trying to put things in perspective here.
So at its core, Zelle is a substitute for cash and check, right? And it's convenient, easy to use. It improves the customer experience. So our customers want it. They want to interact with us digitally. It allows them to access their account in a safer way than perhaps withdrawing money from an ATM or writing a check that they then have to put in the mail, which exposes their account number and the bank routing number, which gives basically somebody all the information they likely need to perpetrate fraud.
So again, this is important to underscore. It strikes me as Zelle, although there's some risk and some fraud, is safer than cash, carrying around a wad of cash to pay people, and it's safer than checks. And there's no reimbursement on a check other than if you can catch it quick enough, you can stop payment. But once that is cleared, I mean, the banks are under no legal requirement to, that was fraud, so you got to reimburse that check, right? Whereas at least on some of these things, you reimburse for Zelle. Okay, so again, I'm just trying to lay out the reality, provide a different perspective here. And from my standpoint, I can see why consumers want to use Zelle. I've always thought for a long time that banks would, kicking and screaming, agree to some kind of payment system that bypassed their very lucrative, very profitable credit card business. But you're doing it. I don't know. Seems like a good deal to consumers. That's all I got. Thanks. I guess we differ on that one.
No. I think you are hitting on a tremendously important point, which is the benefit to the bank.
Some of my other questions in writing.
Senator Johnson, recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Acting Director Rowe, in our secure briefing last week, I made the point that if you don't want conspiracy theories to spread, you need to provide information. I appreciate these photos today. These things could have been released literally within days, and a whole lot more information as well. So Congress needs to provide oversight. we don't have certain investigatory tools like you have, but what we can do is do interviews. So Acting Director Rowe, did you receive our letter from July 25th requesting interviews with 13 individuals of the Secret Service?
We are in receipt of that letter, Senator.
And I don't, Deputy Director Abate, have you seen that letter as well? Do you know who we're requesting interviews with?
Senator, I have not seen
Okay.
the letter.
Do you know whether those individuals submitted to interviews with the FBI? Acting Director Rowe.
We're in the process. Those employees are being interviewed if they have not already been interviewed, sir.
Are those interviews being transcribed?
The FBI interviews, sir?
Yes. Well, we have 302s on those.
Yes, Senator, we will.
Okay, when will Congress get those 302s? When will we get those transcriptions of those interviews?
Senator, I'll take that back and we'll get those to you as soon as possible.
So Acting Director Rowe, when will those individuals be made available for Congress, for this committee to interview them?
Senator, we'll make them available.
How soon? Because memories are short, they can be influenced by events. We need these transcribed interviews as soon as possible.
We will get that done, sir.
Does the Secret Service use encrypted communications at events?
On our radio nets, we do, sir.
Are those memorialized? Are those saved?
The radio traffic from Butler, we did not have recordings.
Do you normally?
Not on the road outside of D.C. or outside of a presidential or vice presidential stop.
So communications between Secret Service agents will not be available like we've gotten the communications from local law enforcement.
I'm sorry, Senator.
So we're not going to be able to get those communications. You didn't save them.
No, sir.
Which is very unfortunate.
It is, sir. And moving forward, I've directed that we will now start recording those so that we will have them moving forward.
And by the way, I'm going to ask for a number of things at the very end to be entered in the record, but one of my preliminary findings is that the Secret Service did not attend the 9 o'clock briefing the day of the event. In your testimony, you said that a site briefing was conducted with Secret Service personnel and law enforcement partners supporting the event. Those both can't be true. So local law enforcement do not believe Secret Service was present at the 9 o'clock briefing. Were they or were they not?
So, Senator, with respect to the snipers that went on national television and gave an interview and said that they did not get a briefing from the Secret Service, they were supporting through mutual aid, and our personnel briefed the tactical team leader that was leading that element that was providing this counter sniper.
Acting Director Rowe, you said that the Secret Service provides explicit instructions to the locals. Were explicit instructions provided to cover the roof of the AGR building and locals just not follow it, or were those explicit instructions not provided?
It's my understanding what was communicated is that the locals had a plan and that they had been there before.
So an awful lot of the chatter on social media has to do with is there partisanship in the Secret Service, providing coverage for some individuals and none for others, about Secret Service coverage or additional coverage enhancements being denied. Was there ever requested additional coverage for Mar-a-Lago?
Senator, we have provided additional resources to the Mar-a-Lago residents.
Was coverage asked for and denied ever?
I'll have to research that, Senator, but I'm happy to tell you we have made significant investments since the former president has left office. Over $4 million of technology, resources, and alarms.
Documents will
Yes,
come
sir.
out eventually to make the point one way or the other. This is an important piece of information that Congress needs to have.
Senator, we'll make those available to you, the
there's-
investments we've made.
There's a report today by Susan Crabtree of Real Clear Politics saying that you denied sniper coverage outside of driving distance to D.C. Is that true?
That is a false statement, sir.
Well, that is incorrect.
That is incorrect.
Okay, I mean, that's the kind of information you need to refute with documentation. Deputy Director Abate, you said this is an assassination attempt and domestic terrorism. It's obviously assassination attempt. Why make the distinction? What is different about that?
We think it's important to cover all the possibilities here and the reality of what we're dealing with and what we've all seen, Senator. And we've learned lessons from the past. The tragic shooting at the baseball field was referenced here. We've learned the lesson from that. That was not opened properly, and we've made changes in the Bureau, and it's reflected here in terms of how this investigation is being approached with a completely open mind and inclusive of all the possibilities, including domestic terrorism.
I fear that makes the investigation potentially partisan. Mr. Chairman, I would like to request that my July 14th letter to Attorney General Garland, Mayorkas, and Wray be entered in the record. It asks for all kinds of information, documentation, asks a lot of questions. My preliminary findings of July 21st and July 23rd, including timelines, a bunch of questions as well, be entered in the record. And then our updated timeline dated today. This goes not only by minute, by second. And we will continue to update this timeline as more information becomes public. This is the way you do investigation. We need to find out literally second by second what happens. So the American public understands the truth.
Without objection, so ordered.
Senator Butler? I yield back. And we turn now to Senator Johnson, who will be followed by Senator Van Hollen.
So to prove my environmental bona fides here, my wife has a hybrid SUV, pretty good sized one. And we've actually had it up over 30 miles per gallon. That's when she plugs it in. Every now and again she doesn't, so I think we're down to about 28 right now. So we watch that, okay? Now, I've always wondered, and it's interesting, Senator Kaine, you mentioned $1 a gallon. Is that I don't know, I've never heard really what does it cost. Is that about right, that it's equivalent of about $1 a gallon per gas to charge a EV versus what it costs for gallon gas, whoever's got the information?
Yeah, Senator, I think that's fair. Obviously, it's going to base largely on the utility rates, but I think the working numbers anywhere from 2/3 less costly compared to a gallon equivalent. So whether it's $1 or $1.50.
I'd say it's about 1/3 of the cost. Again, that's pretty attractive. Okay, you've got the smooth ride. You got fast acceleration. There's a lot of benefits, okay, as well as in the fact if you're just using a hybrid like my wife does, driving around town, never even has to use gas. So I'm not opposed. But my question is, if they've got so many market appeals, why do we need government subsidies? Take it up. I would say you don't. We should end them. Mr. Schwietert.
Sure, Senator. Obviously, you're talking about affordability generally. Excuse me. Obviously, when it comes to the record number of products, it's both the industrial policy as well as, the marketplace dynamics.
We mess up when government doesn't do very well. For example, we spent $7.5 billion to do charging stations. After more than 2 years, we've got 7 of them. Testimony was talking about we've basically run the Highway Trust Fund into insolvency, and we haven't really fixed that. Why is China producing all these electric vehicles? For its own home market? It's for central planning, industrial engineering in other countries, correct? Is there any major Western country that doesn't subsidize EVs because of climate alarmism? How many U.S. automakers are making money producing EVs?
Senator, as I said in my remarks, we're in the early innings. This is a marathon, not a sprint. So yes, costs are going to have to come down.
Yeah, well, how much are they losing on average?
Depends on the manufacturer and their product cycle.
So why are they doing it? Because they're getting government subsidies, right? The consumers are being subsidized, and the automakers are also being subsidized, correct? And the mandate we're talking about are the things like CAFE standards that coerce them to offer EVs so they can produce vehicles that American consumers do want. I mean, I'd never go to 100% EV. Happy to do the hybrid, happy to be environmental. I want the comfort of having an internal combustion engine.
Yeah, Senator, as it relates to the recent auto standards, we've been pretty clear with the Biden administration. Obviously, we need to ensure that there's alignment as it relates to where the market is, as well as encouraging.
No, there won't be alignment where the market is. Government's not that smart. I mean, honestly, $7.5 billion, we have 7 charging stations. We've run the Highway Trust Fund back 2008 insolvent. We haven't fixed that problem. And we're going to have this command economy, and we're going to plan for a growth in the electrical grid. By the way, we don't have the mining capacity. I would argue we really don't have the electrical capacity. Those climate alarmists are generally opposed to nuclear, which certainly would be part of the problem. China dominates the battery industry, and our subsidies are providing a market for China's command economy. How does any of this make sense?
Senator, just with respect, our subsidies are targeted to U.S. manufacturing of batteries through 45X, and the consumer EV tax credits are specifically designed to excise China from the supply chain.
How many consumers have experienced the cost of replacing a battery in an EV?
It's an extremely rare occurrence.
What percent? What
it's an
percent?
Extremely rare occurrence.
It's gonna. They don't last forever, do they? How long do they last?
Neither does an internal combustion engine car or transmission.
There are cars on the road from the 30s and 40s and 50s. How long is an EV battery going to last? And what is the cost to replace it?
EV batteries account for anywhere from 30 to 40% of upfront costs. Obviously, there's warranty and durability built into those batteries, but yes.
How long do they last?
The battery itself can last quite some time, and then, of course, it can be repurposed and reused.
A couple 100,000 miles at least. Yeah. We've had Teslas on the road with that many miles already.
And it's going to cost $10,000, $20,000 to replace?
Well, that's the cost today.
What about recycling of them? What about recycling of wind turbines? I mean, I'm seeing these pictures of these massive dumps of these wind turbines just collapsing. And again, it doesn't make economic sense because government is trying to centrally plan, and government's awful at it.
I just wanted to pipe in if I could,
Sure.
Sir, on battery recycling. Batteries are eminently recyclable and are near
Not
closed
these,
loop.
not the lithium batteries. We don't have capacity for doing it right now.
Well,
we
actually,
haven't developed
we're building that
a way of
capacity.
doing it.
We are building that capacity, and certainly the U.S. is a leader in the standards.
Kind of like Senator Brown was talking about, yeah, we have to rely on all these technological innovations we don't have yet. And let's face it, they've been trying to innovate batteries for decades and really haven't been able to do it, have they?
I'm not sure I would agree with that. The costs have fallen dramatically. The density has doubled in the last 9 years or 7 years. So battery innovation is dramatic, and with
That's
support.
good. So let the marketplace dictate the speed of this innovation. Stop subsidizing this. That's my only point. I'm not opposed to it, but I'm opposed to government intervention in the marketplace. We just screw things up, and as Senator Brown said, we can't afford it. $35 trillion in debt. We just can't afford all this stuff. But thank you, Mr.
Senator
Chairman.
Van Hollen.
Johnson go? Yes, that in order of appearance, that's absolutely right. And the senator from Delaware is always collegial. And Senator Johnson, please.
Well, first of all, thank you very much because I've got a noon meeting and apologize I haven't been here for the full time because this is an incredibly important hearing. Let me state at the outset, I think growing income inequality is a real problem. It truly is. I think we all have to recognize that. Also, I think what's undeniable is our tax code is a grotesque and complex monstrosity. And I guess I come at this from the standpoint, if we were to simplify and rationalize it, we could fix an awful lot of these things. And the example I'll use is I know the chairman would like to tax unrealizable gains, which I think violates a basic tenet of taxation, wherewithal to pay. There's another way of addressing this, though. One of the problems is about 73% of corporate income is never double taxed. It builds up inside these corporations. I think it distorts our M&A market. So what I've suggested is, why not treat the 5% American businesses that are C Corps like we do 95% of other businesses and tax the business income every year at the ownership level. I know C Corps would scream, but it would go a long way toward addressing that particular problem. I've presented that to my colleagues. It's a way of simplifying it. Another problem we have is capital gains tax. It's just an arbitrary number. It really makes no sense. I mean, what's trying to address the fact that it's unfair to tax inflationary gains, correct? So why not just index out the inflationary gains? It's very easy to do, and then tax that at ordinary rates. Now, I just think it's bizarre that we have different levels of taxation for different types of income. From my standpoint, income is income. So that's the direction we ought to move our tax code toward: simplify, rationalize it. Like I said, it's a rational thought to say income is income. You only tax income when you have the wherewithal to pay. If you base things on certain principles, I think that'd go a long way toward fixing things. I did want to ask Mr. Gupta and Mr. Lord, I think both of you complained about stepped-up basis, but isn't it true that stepped-up basis is applied to assets that are subject to gift and estate tax? So if you were to start taxing the stepped-up basis, you're double taxing that. Again, I realize there's certain assets that are not subject to, because they're exempt. You have the personal exemption. But beyond that, it'd be grossly unfair to provide a gift or estate tax, and then on top of that, tax the gain. Would you not agree with that?
Senator, I would respectfully disagree. For a couple reasons. The estate tax and the income tax are two different taxes. We have a kind of a transactional tax system in America. If I get paid wages and then I go to the store and pay sales tax on my purchases, that's not double taxation. But beyond that, the estate and gift tax planning is such that it actually can be accomplished to avoid estate and gift tax entirely and get stepped up basis.
But let me go back. So if you're talking about assets that are income producing, and you go to my system where all income is taxed at the ownership level every year, it's already been taxed. If you're talking about assets that appreciate primarily because of inflation, you ought to be indexing that out anyway. You know, then on top of that, you throw a penalty of a transfer because of a gift tax, or again, whatever. That's the penalty tax. So, you know, you're transferring an asset to your heir or gifting to somebody. Now we're going to penalize that. Mr. Brabant, I mean, can you comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real concern for family businesses, and the estate tax is always a huge deal for family businesses. If you compound this with getting rid of stepped-up basis, there's a real concern that family businesses will more often than not be sold, and usually to larger businesses and who don't have the same footprint in local communities.
Mr. Bunn, you want to comment a little bit just in terms of the irrationality of how we treat different types of income differently? And basically what I'm talking about is, you know, let's simplify and rationalize our tax code. That ought to be, you know, kind of our driving mantra in terms of fixing these things.
Yeah, I would say on stepped-up basis, if you change that policy without changing anything else, it's going to create a lot of significant problems and tax hikes. Some of the problems that Mr. Brabant mentioned. I think generally, though, we're in agreement, moving towards a more simple system, a system that we can, recognize the horizontal and vertical equity, as many public finance folks talk about, and be able to just rationalize things so that compliance and administration are lower cost.
So again, I would just suggest to focus on areas of agreement. I agree. I think we agree. Growing income inequality is a real problem. I think we agree we have an incredibly complex tax system. So let's focus on that area of agreement, and let's try and make our tax system simpler and more rational, and it'll address a lot of the problem in terms of growing income inequality. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. We're going to go to Senator Warren in just a second, but